Welcome back to Jack and Rex Tales. The letter had been sitting in that barn for 11 years. Jack Thompson didn't know that yet. He was standing at the kitchen sink at 5 in the morning, watching the frost on the window and thinking about nothing. The particular kind of nothing that men think about when they have trained themselves over decades not to think about anything that hurts. His coffee had gone cold. He hadn't noticed. Rex was sitting behind him in the middle of the kitchen floor, which was unusual. Rex slept until 6. He had slept until 6 every morning for 11 years, with the reliability of a clock that never needed winding. Jack turned around. Rex was looking at the door. Not anxious, not alert in the way that meant danger, just looking at it with that deep, unhurried attention that Jack had learned over 11 years together meant something was waiting, something that needed to be found. "All right," Jack said quietly. He set the cold coffee down and reached for his boots. He had not wanted the farm. That was the simplest truth of it. Earl Thompson had died in February, quietly, the way Earl did everything, without requesting help or leaving much explanation, and Jack had driven up from Billings, signed the paperwork, and stood in the frozen yard looking at 60 acres of exhausted land and a farmhouse that needed a new roof, new wiring, new everything. He was 50 years old. He had a bad knee, a storage unit in Billings containing everything he owned, and Rex. That was the full inventory of his life, and he had built a careful, functional piece around it. 30 years as a Navy SEAL had taught him not to land too heavily in any one place. You learned to keep yourself portable. You learned that attachment was a liability, not because the people you loved weren't worth loving, but because the orders always came, and the missions always pulled you away, and over time the gap between who you were and who you might have been in a different life became too wide to look at directly. So you stopped looking, you packed light, you moved. The plan for the farm was simple. Fix the worst of it, list it by spring, walk away. He was good at walking away. It was, if he was being honest, the thing he was best at. Rex walked beside him through the frost-stiff grass toward the barn, and Jack watched him with the particular attention he gave to things he didn't understand yet. The barn door was open. Not broken, not forced, just open. The way something is left open when someone has run out of other options. Jack put his hand on the frame and looked inside. The light was thin and gray. His father's old tractor sat under a canvas tarp. Hay bales lined the far wall, the smell of cold wood, and beneath it, something warmer, the ghost of a fire recently put out. And then he saw them. An old man against the far wall, knees drawn up, eyes already open. The eyes of a man who had learned that the worst usually arrived without warning, and who had decided some time ago to simply watch for it rather than flinch. Beside him, tucked under his arm with a wool blanket to her chin, a girl, 9 years old maybe, dark eyes, a smear of dried mud on her left cheek. She wasn't frightened, she was past frightened. She had the face of a child who had been tired for a very long time. Rex walked past Jack across the hay-dusted floor and stopped in front of the girl. He lowered his big head slowly. She looked at him for a moment, just a moment, and then lifted one small hand from under the blanket and placed it on top of his head. Rex closed his eyes. The old man watched the dog, and something locked inside his face came quietly undone. "We didn't take anything," he said. His voice was rough with cold and with the effort of holding himself together. "I want you to know that first." Jack looked at him for a long moment. "I can see that," he said. His name was Walter Greer. 67 years old, former carpenter, grandfather. The girl was Lily, his daughter's child. His daughter had died the previous April from an illness that arrived in January and left nothing behind by spring. Lily's father had been gone long before that.
The state had begun proceedings to place Lily in foster care, while Walter, who had no fixed address and a filing cabinet's worth of unresolved paperwork, tried to navigate a system that moved on its own schedule and had no particular interest in the difference between a man who had given up and a man who had simply been worn down. They had been living in Walter's truck for 6 weeks. The barn door had been unlocked. It was cold outside. That was the whole story. Jack listened to all of it, standing in the doorway. He didn't interrupt, and he didn't offer the kind of packaged sympathy that makes people feel processed rather than heard. When Walter finished, Jack looked at Lily, who was still resting her hand on Rex's head with the focused gentleness of a child who understood, instinctively, that some creatures needed to be touched carefully. "Have you eaten?" Jack asked. Walter straightened slightly. "We're not here asking for—" "I didn't ask what you were asking for," Jack said. "I asked if you'd eaten." A silence. Walter's jaw tightened, then released. "Not since yesterday morning." Jack nodded once. "Come inside." He told himself it was temporary. A few days became a week became 3. Jack gave them the small bedroom off the kitchen without mentioning that it meant he was sleeping on the couch. He fixed the furnace because the nights were still hard and Lily had a cough he didn't like the sound of. He bought groceries, more than he usually would, different things, cereal and apple juice and the kind of soup a child might actually eat, and didn't let himself calculate what it was costing because the number wasn't going to change what needed to be done. Rex attached himself to Lily in the complete, unconditional way that dogs sometimes attach to the people carrying the heaviest weight. Every morning he was outside her door when she woke. Every evening she sat on the porch steps with her arm around him, not talking, just existing beside him the way children exist beside things that feel safe. Jack watched them from the kitchen window sometimes and felt something stir in the part of him he had spent 30 years keeping carefully still. But the farm was bleeding money he didn't have. A man named Douglas Crane arrived one Tuesday in a clean black truck with a business card and a number written on the back of it. More than the land was worth, enough to settle everything and walk away with something left over. "Your father wasn't interested in selling," Crane said pleasantly, "but circumstances change." Jack looked at the number. "I'll think about it," he said. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with the bills in front of him and Rex under the table with his chin on Jack's foot, and he looked at the math for a long time and didn't like what it told him. Walter came to him 4 mornings later. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in both hands and the careful expression of a man who has rehearsed something painful and is still not ready to say it. "We're gonna go," Walter said. "Me and Lily." Jack looked up. "Where?" "I don't know yet, but I talked to Lily last night." His voice thinned at the edges. "She's 9 years old, and she told me she doesn't want it to be the reason you lose your father's land." He stopped, pressed his lips together. 9 years old, and that's what she said. Jack opened his mouth. The words were somewhere inside him. He could feel their shape, but they wouldn't come. They never came when he needed them most. 30 years of training himself to function in silence had also trained him to go quiet in the moments that required the most from him. Walter nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked down the hall.
Jack stood at the counter and listened to the sounds of them getting ready to leave. The soft movement of the bedroom door, the careful zip of a bag. And then, from the porch, the sound he hadn't prepared for, Lily's voice, small and serious, saying goodbye to Rex. He couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. Rex came inside a few minutes later and stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at Jack with those amber eyes. And in them, Jack saw something that looked painfully like a question. He had no answer. He walked to the front window and watched Walter's truck back slowly down the gravel drive. Lily was in the passenger seat. She didn't look back. She was looking straight ahead with the expression of someone who has decided that looking back makes it worse. The truck reached the road, turned, disappeared. Rex sat beside Jack at the window and leaned his full weight against Jack's leg, and Jack put his hand on the dog's head and stood there in the quiet farmhouse and felt the silence settle over him like something physical. He had been alone in a lot of places in his life: forward operating bases, hotel rooms in foreign cities, hospital wards, the storage unit in Billings. But this was different. This was the silence of a place that had just had life in it. It was the loneliest sound he had ever heard. That night, Rex stood up from the couch, walked to the front door, and looked back at Jack. Jack recognized that look. "All right," he said. Rex led him across the dark yard to the barn. He walked to the far wall, the same corner where Lily had slept, and stopped. He sniffed slowly along the base of the boards, then sat down and looked at Jack with that absolute, patient certainty. Jack crouched down. He ran his hand along the base of the wall and felt it, a board that moved, deliberately loose, hidden in plain sight. Behind it was a metal box. Inside the box was a leather journal, an envelope of cash, and a letter folded in thirds. The letter was in his father's handwriting, the same careful, unhurried print Earl Thompson had used his entire life on birthday cards Jack had received at whatever base he'd been stationed at, on the single letter Earl had written him after his mother passed, on the grocery lists Jack had found tucked in kitchen drawers when he first arrived to settle the estate. He sat down on the barn floor. Rex pressed himself against Jack's side, warm and solid and present. And Jack unfolded the letter and read it in the thin light from the single bare bulb above him. His father had been doing this for 22 years. The farm had never been just a farm. Earl and Martha Thompson had quietly, without announcement or recognition or any desire for either, been offering shelter to people with nowhere else to go. Families passing through hard seasons, elderly men unmoored by loss, mothers rebuilding, children who needed somewhere soft to land while harder things got resolved. They had kept the barn unlocked and the farmhouse door open, and they had never once spoken about it publicly because, Earl wrote, the moment you tell people about your kindness, it stops being kindness and starts being performance. The money was what they had set aside over years, not a reward, a foundation. If you found this, his father had written, it means you stayed long enough to find it, which means you chose people over practicality, and that is the only inheritance I ever truly wanted to leave you. I know I wasn't easy to understand. I know I didn't explain myself when I should have, but I watched you grow into a man who knew how to endure, and I always believed, even when you were far away and the distance felt permanent, that you would find your way to this. The farm is yours, son. So is the choice. I only ask one thing. If you stayed long enough to read this, stay a little longer. Jack read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands and sat in the cold barn with the dog pressed against him and did something he had not done since he was a young man standing at his mother's grave in the rain. He wept. Not loudly, not with the kind of grief that announces itself, just quietly, in the way that men weep when something they have been carrying for a very long time, something they didn't even have a name for, finally sets itself down. He cried for his father, who he had never fully understood until now. He cried for the years he had spent moving, always one step ahead of anything that might require him to stay. He cried for the girl who had sat on these porch steps with his dog and told her grandfather she didn't want to be a burden. Rex stayed against him the entire time, still and warm and certain, the way Rex always was in the moments that mattered most, Not fixing anything, not asking anything. Just staying. Just being there. In the morning, Jack called Walter. It took 2 attempts. When Walter answered, his voice was carefully neutral, the way it gets when someone is bracing for disappointment. "I found something in the barn last night," Jack said. "I need you to come back, both of you." A long pause. "Jack, this place was built for people like you," Jack said. "My father built it for people like you, and I'm not selling it." Another silence, longer this time. Then faintly, from somewhere on Walter's end of the line, Jack heard Lily's voice, asking who it was. He heard Walter's voice answer her. And then he heard a sound he hadn't expected, small and sudden and completely unguarded. The sound of a 9-year-old girl who has been holding herself together for a very long time, finally letting go. Jack stood in the kitchen and looked out at the farm, the sagging fence line, the soft roof, the 60 acres his father had quietly given his life to, and felt something shift permanently inside him. Not traumatically, not all at once, just the slow, irreversible settling of a man who has finally found the place he was always supposed to be.
The roof was fixed by May, the east fence by July. Walter's hands, which had spent 30 years doing carpentry before his knees slowed him down, turned out to be exactly what the farm needed. Lily started school that fall, 4 miles down the road. On her first morning, she stood at the end of the gravel driveway in a new backpack, and Rex sat beside her and waited with her until the bus came, and Jack stood on the porch and watched them both, and felt the particular, quiet fullness of a man who has stopped running and discovered that what he was running from was never the danger he thought it was. He never called Douglas Crane back. The farm still needed things, it probably always would, but some places aren't meant to be finished. They're meant to be tended, the way his father had tended it, quietly, without recognition, one open door and one open season at a time. Jack Thompson had spent 30 years serving his country. He spent the rest of his life serving his corner of it. And Rex walked beside him through every season of it, steady, faithful, unhurried, the way good companions do. Not solving anything, not explaining anything, just staying, which in the end is the most important thing anyone can ever do. Real courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a man who had every reason to walk away, choosing quietly, simply, to stay. If stories like this speak to something in you, something about loyalty, legacy, and the kind of kindness that never makes the news, subscribe to Jack and Rex Tales, because this world still needs reminding of what truly matters. This story carries meaningful value across several dimensions of human experience. It portrays veteran life honestly, not through action or heroism, but through the inner silence of a man who has spent decades learning not to feel, and the slow, painful, necessary process of unlearning that. For older American viewers who have loved veterans or been veterans themselves, that portrait will feel deeply true. The bond between Jack and Rex reflects what research has long confirmed about the relationship between dogs and their owners, particularly veterans, where an animal's steady, wordless presence provides a form of emotional support that human language sometimes cannot reach. Rex never rescues anyone dramatically. He simply stays, and in staying, he models something profound. The story also brings quiet dignity to the experience of families falling through the cracks of social systems, grandparents raising grandchildren, people without addresses trying to hold their families together, without reducing them to objects of pity. Walter and Lily are fully human, fully dignified, and their struggle reflects real circumstances faced by real families across rural America every day.
At its deepest level, this is a story about legacy, about the values parents pass to children, not through instruction, but through example, and about how purpose can be inherited just as surely as land or money. Earl Thompson never explained himself to his son, but he built something that explained itself when Jack was finally ready to understand it. That is perhaps the most universal truth in the story, that we often only understand the people who shaped us long after they are gone, and that it is never too late to continue what they started.